The small bell above the door of Mercy's diner chimed as Harold Wilson pushed it open, the familiar sound a stark contrast to the explosions that still echoed in his dreams. The rain outside had soaked through his worn navy jacket, the one with faded patches that told a story few people bothered to ask about anymore. His silver hair, now damp and clinging to his forehead, had once been military short and brown when he served in Vietnam, decades before most of the other customers in the diner had even been born. The lunch rush had died down, leaving just a handful of patrons scattered throughout the restaurant. Harold shuffled toward his usual spot, the corner booth with a view of both the entrance and the back exit, a habit he'd never managed to break. His arthritis made each step a small battle, but he'd fought bigger wars and wasn't about to let this one defeat him. Mercy's diner wasn't fancy. Its vinyl booths had seen better days, and the laminated menus were worn at the edges from thousands of hands flipping through them. But it was clean, the coffee was decent, and most importantly, it was consistent, something Harold had come to value more than most people realized. The usual Mr. Wilson? A young woman approached his table, coffee pot in hand, her name tag reading, Emma. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and though her uniform was as standard as they came, there was nothing standard about the genuine warmth in her smile. Harold nodded, the motion slight but deliberate. "Yes, please, Emma." She poured his coffee with practiced precision, not spilling a drop. "Coming right up. How are you doing today? That rain's something else, isn't it?" "Been through worse," Harold replied, his voice gruff but not unkind. He'd been coming to Mercy's for nearly 3 years now, ever since his wife Margaret had passed. At first it was just to escape the silence of his empty house, but over time it had become part of his routine. 3 times a week, same order: black coffee, turkey club sandwich, side of fries. Emma nodded, understanding the layers in his simple response. She'd been waiting tables at Mercy's for just over a year, working her way through nursing school. In that time, she'd learned that Harold said more in what he didn't say than in what he did. "I'll get that sandwich started for you," she said, offering another smile before heading back to the kitchen. Harold watched her go, then turned his attention to the window. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming against the glass in an uneven rhythm. He took a sip of his coffee and let the warmth spread through him, chasing away some of the dampness that had settled in his bones. At the counter, Emma placed his order with the cook, a burly man named Mitch who'd been at Mercy's longer than anyone could remember. "Turkey club for Mr. Wilson," she said, then hesitated. "And Mitch? Make it a good one, yeah? He looks colder than usual today." Mitch glanced through the small window that separated the kitchen from the dining area, his eyes finding Harold's hunched figure in the corner. "Always do," he replied, already reaching for the bread. While she waited for the order, Emma noticed the entrance door swing open again. 4 young men walked in, their military haircuts and straight postures immediately giving them away as service members even before she spotted their Marine Corps uniforms. They were talking among themselves, their voices carrying the easy camaraderie of people who had seen things together that most others couldn't imagine. "Anywhere you'd like," Emma called to them, gesturing to the nearly empty diner. The tallest of them nodded in acknowledgement, and they chose a booth not far from Harold's. As they passed by the older man, one of them, a freckle-faced Marine who couldn't have been more than 22, noticed the patches on Harold's jacket. The young Marine slowed his pace, his eyes lingering on the insignia of the 25th Infantry Division. There was a moment of silent recognition before he continued on to join his friends. Emma grabbed a stack of menus and made her way to their table. "Welcome to Mercy's," she said, distributing the menus. "Can I start you boys off with some coffee? On a day like this, you look like you could use it." "Yes, ma'am," the tallest one replied, a hint of southern drawl in his voice. "4 coffees would be great." As Emma turned to get their drinks, the cook called out that Harold's order was ready. She picked up the plate, the familiar weight of it in her hands, and walked back to Harold's table. The turkey club looked the same as always. Neatly cut triangles, a generous helping of turkey, crisp lettuce, and just the right amount of mayo, exactly how he liked it. The fries were golden and steaming, straight from the fryer. "Here you go, Mr. Wilson," she said, setting the plate down in front of him. "Nice and hot." Harold looked up at her, his weathered face breaking into a small smile. "Thank you, Emma." She lingered for a moment, noticing how his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his napkin. It seemed worse today, and there was a weariness in his eyes that tugged at her heart. She'd learned bits and pieces of his story over the months, how he'd served in Vietnam, how he'd lost his wife 3 years ago, how his son lived on the other side of the country and rarely called. "Everything all right today?" she asked, keeping her voice casual. Harold's eyes met hers, and for a brief moment she saw a flicker of something, vulnerability perhaps, or resignation. "Just one of those days," he said finally, his voice softer than usual. "Anniversary's coming up. Would have been 52 years. Emma's chest tightened. She'd never been married herself, but she could see the weight of that loss in the slump of his shoulders. "I'm sorry," she said simply, because there wasn't much else to say. Harold nodded, the motion almost imperceptible. Then he glanced at his plate and reached into his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate. Emma watched as he pulled out a worn leather wallet and opened it. She didn't miss the way his expression changed when he looked inside, a flash of concern quickly masked. He began, then cleared his throat. "Seems I've forgotten my card today. Must have left it at home. I'll just have the coffee for now and come back later for lunch." Emma knew immediately what was happening. She'd seen it before with other elderly customers, pride battling with limited means. Harold had never forgotten his wallet before, which meant only one thing: he couldn't afford his meal today. Without hesitation, she shook her head. "Don't worry about it, Mr. Wilson. This one's on the house today." Harold's expression shifted, a complex mix of gratitude and discomfort. "I can't let you do that, Emma. It's not right." "You're not letting me do anything," she replied firmly. "It's already done. Consider it a thank you for your service." She nodded toward his jacket with the faded patches. "Besides, you're our most loyal customer. If we can't treat you once in a while, what kind of place would this be?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see the internal struggle playing out across his face. Finally, he gave a small nod. "I'll pay you back next time," he said, the words more of a promise to himself than to her. "If you insist," Emma replied, knowing full well she wouldn't accept it. "Now eat up before it gets cold." As she turned to walk away, she didn't see the way Harold's eyes misted over, or how he took a moment to compose himself before picking up his sandwich. But the 4 Marines, sitting just a few booths away, had witnessed the entire exchange, their own conversations falling silent as they watched. The freckle-faced Marine leaned forward slightly. "Did you see that?" he murmured to his companions. The tallest one nodded, his eyes still on Harold. "Yeah, I did." What happened next would change everything, not just for Harold and Emma, but for everyone at Mercy's Diner that rainy afternoon. Emma returned to the Marines' table with their coffees, unaware of the silent exchange that had passed between them. She set the mugs down one by one, steam rising in lazy curls above the dark liquid. "Ready to order?" she asked, pulling out her notepad. The tallest Marine, Staff Sergeant James Cooper, according to the name on his uniform, glanced once more at Harold before turning his attention to Emma. "Actually, ma'am, could you give us a minute?" "Sure thing," Emma replied with a smile. "Take your time." As she walked away to check on her other tables, the 4 Marines huddled closer, their voices low. "That old-timer's wearing 25th Infantry Division patches," said Lance Corporal Mike Reeves, the freckle-faced Marine who'd noticed Harold first. "Vietnam era. My granddad served in the same division." Sergeant Cooper nodded. "And did you see what just happened? The waitress is covering his meal." Private First Class Darnell Washington, the youngest of the group at barely 20, frowned. Man shouldn't have to worry about paying for a sandwich after serving his country. The 4th Marine, Corporal Alex Rodriguez, had been quietly observing the exchange between Harold and Emma. Unlike his companions, who'd all enlisted after high school, Rodriguez had seen 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining this unit. There was something in Harold's demeanor that he recognized. The way the older man sat with his back to the wall, how his eyes occasionally scanned the room, the slight flinch when the kitchen door slammed shut. The echoes of combat didn't fade easily. Rodriguez knew that better than most. "Let's do something about it," Rodriguez said suddenly, his voice firm with decision. The others looked at him, waiting for him to continue. "Not just for today's meal," Rodriguez clarified. "Something more." At Harold's table, the old veteran was eating his sandwich slowly, methodically, the way a man does when he's learned that some meals can't be taken for granted. His gnarled fingers, once strong enough to field strip a rifle blindfolded, now struggled slightly with the simple task of holding his sandwich together. Each bite was deliberate, measured, as if he were rationing it without realizing. As he ate, his mind drifted back to other meals. Sea rations in the humid jungles of Vietnam, Sunday dinners with Margaret after they were married, hospital cafeteria food during her final days. Food had always been more than sustenance to Harold. It was a marker of time, of place, of circumstance. The diner around him faded into the background as memories washed over him. It had been nearly 50 years since Vietnam, but some days it felt like yesterday. The sounds, the smells, the fear, they had a way of resurfacing when he least expected it. And now, with Margaret gone, there were fewer distractions to keep the memories at bay. Their anniversary was in 3 days. 52 years would have been quite a milestone. Harold had been planning to visit her grave with flowers, peonies her favorite, but his Social Security check wasn't due for another week, and after paying his utilities and medication costs, there wasn't much left. The flowers would have to wait, and now, apparently, so would his dignity. He hated accepting charity. Throughout his life, Harold had prided himself on self-sufficiency. Even when times were tough, and there had been plenty of tough times, he and Margaret had always managed on their own. But lately it seemed like the world was determined to remind him of his limitations, of his increasing dependence on the kindness of others. Emma's gesture had touched him deeply, though he'd tried not to show it. There was something about her that reminded him of Margaret, not in appearance, but in spirit. That same innate kindness, the ability to see what others needed before they asked for it. Back at the Marines' table, a plan was taking shape. Sergeant Cooper had taken charge, as was his nature. "Rodriguez, you said you wanted to do something more. What are you thinking?" Rodriguez leaned forward, his coffee untouched. "My uncle runs a veterans outreach program back home. They do this thing where local businesses can set up a fund for vets. People contribute, and the vets can eat for free, no questions asked." "Like a pay-it-forward system?" Washington asked. Rodriguez nodded. "Exactly. It preserves their dignity because it's not a handout. It's one warrior taking care of another." Reeves's face lit up with enthusiasm. "We could start it right here. Put some money together, talk to the management, see if other customers would contribute." Cooper considered this for a moment, his eyes serious. "It's a good idea, but we need to be careful about how we approach it. The last thing we want is to embarrass that man." As they continued their discussion, Emma returned to Harold's table. He had finished his sandwich and most of his fries and was nursing the last of his coffee. "How was everything, Mr. Wilson?" she asked, already reaching for his empty plate. Perfect, as always, he replied, his voice a little stronger now that he had eaten. Thank you, Emma. I won't forget this. She smiled, brushing off his gratitude with a small wave. Don't give it another thought, that's what friends are for. Friends. The word lingered in Harold's mind as she walked away. It had been a long time since he'd thought of himself as having friends. Acquaintances, sure. Familiar faces, yes, but friends? That implied a connection, a mutual care that he'd almost forgotten existed outside of his memories. Emma made her way back to the Marine's table, notepad ready. Have you boys decided what you'd like? Cooper straightened in his seat, his decision made. Actually, ma'am, we'd like to speak with the manager if that's possible. Emma's expression shifted, a flicker of concern crossing her features. Is there a problem with your service? Not at all, Cooper reassured her quickly. Quite the opposite, in fact. We just have a proposition we'd like to discuss. Emma hesitated, then nodded. I'll get Mr. Grayson for you. He's the owner. As she disappeared into the back office, Harold stood up from his booth, his movements slow and careful. He adjusted his jacket, making sure his patches were visible, a small habit of pride he'd never lost, and began making his way toward the door. As he passed by the Marine's table, he gave them a small nod of acknowledgement, soldier to soldiers, a silent recognition of their shared experience despite the decades that separated their service. Mike Reeves stood up immediately, extending his hand. Sir, Lance Corporal Reeves, United States Marine Corps, it's an honor to meet you. Harold paused, momentarily surprised by the gesture. He took the young Marine's hand, his grip firmer than his appearance might suggest. Harold Wilson, 25th Infantry. The honor's mine, son. The other Marines had risen as well, forming a small semicircle of respect around the older veteran. Cooper stepped forward. Staff Sergeant Cooper, sir. Vietnam? 2 tours, Harold confirmed, a shadow crossing his weathered features. Long time ago now. Not so long, Rodriguez said quietly, something in his tone making Harold look at him more closely. Their eyes met in silent understanding. We were wondering, sir, Cooper continued, if you might have a few minutes to sit with us. We'd appreciate the chance to hear some of your experiences if you're willing to share. Harold glanced toward the door, then back at the young men before him. The rain was still coming down hard outside, and his small apartment would be empty and silent as it always was. These young Marines, they reminded him of himself and his buddies decades ago, before life and war and time had taken their toll. I suppose I could stay a bit longer, he said finally, though I don't know if my old stories would interest you boys much. I can guarantee they would, sir, Washington said earnestly. As Harold settled into their booth, Emma emerged from the back with a middle-aged man in a button-up shirt and tie, Mr. Grayson, the owner. They paused, observing the unexpected gathering at the Marine's table. Well, would you look at that? Grayson murmured to Emma. What do you think is going on there? Emma shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips. I'm not sure, but whatever it is, I think it's exactly what Mr. Wilson needs today. Little did she know, it was also exactly what the diner and the entire community needed as well. The Marines' plan was about to change everything, starting with one elderly veteran and one kind-hearted waitress. Mr. Grayson approached the table where Harold sat with the 4 Marines, curiosity evident in his expression. Emma followed close behind, coffee pot in hand, ready to offer refills. Gentlemen, Grayson said with a nod, I understand you wanted to speak with me. Sergeant Cooper stood and extended his hand. Yes, sir. Staff Sergeant James Cooper. Thank you for taking the time. Grayson shook his hand firmly. Rick Grayson, this is my place. Emma says you have some kind of proposition. Cooper glanced at his fellow Marines, then at Harold, who was watching the exchange with quiet interest. "We do, sir, but perhaps we could discuss it privately, just for a few minutes." Harold began to rise. "I should be going anyway. Don't want to intrude." "Actually, sir," Rodriguez interrupted gently, "we were hoping you might stay and talk with Lance Corporal Reeves here while we chat with Mr. Grayson, if you don't mind." Harold hesitated, then slowly lowered himself back into the booth. "Well, I suppose I've got nowhere pressing to be." Emma stepped forward, refilling Harold's coffee without being asked. "I'll keep you company too, Mr. Wilson. My shift's almost over anyway." She glanced at Grayson, who gave her a small nod of approval. As Cooper, Washington, and Rodriguez followed Grayson to his small office at the back of the diner, Mike Reeves slid into the booth across from Harold. There was an earnestness in the young Marine's freckled face that reminded Harold of another young soldier from long ago, himself, before Vietnam had changed everything. "My grandfather was with the 25th too," Reeves said, breaking the momentary silence. "Sergeant Frank Reeves. Did you maybe cross paths with him?" Harold's eyes grew distant, searching through decades of memories. "Reeves. Tall fellow. Had a scar above his right eye." Reeves's face lit up. "That's him. Got that scar from a bar fight in Honolulu before shipping out." Harold chuckled, the sound rusty but genuine. "I remember him. Good man in a firefight. Saved my bacon once near Ku Chai. We lost touch after rotating home." He paused, studying Reeves's face more carefully. "You've got his eyes. How's he doing these days?" The young Marine's smile faltered slightly. "He passed 5 years ago, sir. Agent Orange-related complications." Harold nodded solemnly. "I'm sorry to hear that. Too many of us went that way." He took a sip of his coffee, his hand trembling slightly. "You following in his footsteps then?" "Trying to, sir. He's the reason I joined up." Meanwhile, in Grayson's cramped office, Cooper was outlining their idea. The room was small but neat, with framed photos of the diner through the years covering one wall. A desk cluttered with invoices and schedules took up most of the space. "So let me get this straight," Grayson said, leaning back in his chair. "You want to start a fund for veterans to eat here for free?" Rodriguez nodded. "Yes, sir. It's a pay-it-forward system. Customers who want to contribute can add a few dollars to their bill. That money goes into a pool specifically for veterans who might be struggling. Like Mr. Wilson out there," Washington added quietly. Grayson's expression softened. "Emma told me what happened. She's got a good heart, that girl. Always looking out for the regulars." He paused, considering. How would it work exactly? Cooper leaned forward. "It's simple. You keep track of the contributions. When a veteran comes in, whether they identify themselves or you recognize them, they can order a meal that's covered by the fund. No questions asked, no embarrassment." "We'd start it off ourselves," Rodriguez added. "The 4 of us can put in $50 each to get it going." Grayson rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "And you think people around here would contribute?" "We do," Cooper said confidently. "From what we've seen of this place, you've got a tight-knit community. People take care of their own." Back in the dining area, Emma had settled into the booth beside Harold, her apron now removed and her ponytail loosened. The afternoon rain continued to drum against the windows, creating a cozy atmosphere inside the diner. "So how long have you been in town, Mr. Wilson?" Reeves asked, genuinely interested in the older veteran's story. "Going on 40 years now," Harold replied. "Margaret, that's my late wife, and I moved here after I got out of the service. Worked at the factory on the east side until it closed down in '98, then did security work until my knees couldn't take it anymore." He smiled slightly. "Margaret always said I was too stubborn to retire properly." Emma's expression softened at the mention of Harold's wife. "You must miss her very much." Harold's eyes misted over, but his voice remained steady. "Every day, especially this time of year. Our anniversary's coming up, would have been 52 years. Reeves looked down at his coffee, unsure what to say in the face of such loss. Emma, however, reached over and placed her hand gently on Harold's arm. "Tell us about her," she encouraged softly. "What was she like?" And so Harold began to speak, hesitantly at first, then with growing animation. He told them about meeting Margaret at a USO dance before his first deployment, how they'd written letters every day while he was overseas, how she'd waited for him despite her parents' disapproval. He described their small wedding, their struggles during his difficult readjustment to civilian life, and how she'd never once wavered in her support. "She was a nurse," Harold said, pride evident in his voice. "Worked at County General for 30 years. Could have been head of nursing if she'd wanted, but she preferred working directly with patients. Said administrators just pushed papers, but nurses saved lives." Emma smiled. "That's why I'm in nursing school now, to make a difference like that." Harold looked at her with newfound appreciation. "You'll be a good one. You've got the heart for it." In Grayson's office, the discussion had progressed to logistics. The owner was warming to the idea, asking thoughtful questions and offering practical suggestions. "We could put up a small sign by the register," he proposed. "Nothing flashy, just letting folks know about the opportunity to contribute. And maybe something discreet that veterans would recognize," Rodriguez suggested. "So they know they can come here even if they're having a tough time." Grayson nodded, then asked the question that had been on his mind since they'd first mentioned the idea. "This is a fine thing you boys are proposing, but I'm curious. Why here? Why our little diner?" The three Marines exchanged glances, and it was Washington who finally answered. "Because we saw one of your employees do something kind without being asked or expecting anything in return. That tells us what kind of place this is." Grayson smiled, a hint of pride in his expression. "Emma's something special, that's for sure. Been through a lot herself, but never lets it dim her light." He stood up, extending his hand. "All right, gentlemen, let's do this. I'll match whatever you put in to get it started." When they returned to the dining area, they found Harold deep in conversation with Reeves and Emma, his earlier reticence completely gone. He was gesturing animatedly, describing something that had both of his listeners leaning forward in rapt attention. And then the sergeant says, "Son, if you can find that chicken, you can keep it, but I wouldn't recommend eating anything that can outrun a platoon of Marines." Harold finished, and both Emma and Reeves burst into laughter. Cooper smiled at the scene, then cleared his throat softly to announce their presence. "Sounds like we missed a good story." Harold looked up, his eyes brighter than they had been earlier. "Just boring an audience with old war tales. Nothing important." "I wouldn't say that, sir," Reeves said earnestly. "Mr. Wilson was just telling us about his time near the DMZ in '68. Grayson stepped forward, extending his hand to Harold. "Mr. Wilson, I don't think we've been properly introduced. Rick Grayson, I own this place." Harold shook his hand, suddenly looking a bit uncomfortable. "Harold Wilson, you've got a fine establishment here, Mr. Grayson, and a very kind employee." He glanced at Emma, who smiled warmly in return. "That I do," Grayson agreed. "And I'd like to speak with you about something, if you have a moment." The four Marines exchanged knowing looks as Grayson slid into the booth across from Harold. Outside, the rain had finally begun to let up, and a few rays of late afternoon sunlight were breaking through the clouds, casting golden stripes across the diner floor. "These young men have just proposed an idea that I think has real merit," Grayson began, gesturing toward the Marines. "And I'd like to get your thoughts on it, as someone who's served our country." Harold looked surprised. "My thoughts? I'm not sure what help I could be." More than you know, Cooper said quietly. And as they began to explain their plan to the elderly veteran, his expression slowly transformed from confusion to disbelief, and finally, to something that looked very much like hope. The small spark that had been ignited by Emma's simple act of kindness was about to grow into something none of them could have anticipated. And for Harold Wilson, this rainy afternoon at Mercy's diner was becoming a turning point he never saw coming. Harold stared at the group surrounding him, his weathered hands wrapped tightly around his coffee mug. The Marines had just finished explaining their proposal, the Veterans Meal Fund, how it would work, and most importantly, why they wanted to start it. "So let me get this straight," Harold said slowly, his voice thick with emotion he was trying to control. "People would just contribute money so veterans can eat here, without knowing who they're helping?" Cooper nodded. "That's right, sir. It's not charity, it's recognition. One generation of warriors supporting another." Harold looked down at his empty plate, the one Emma had given him on the house just an hour earlier. A lifetime of pride warred with the practical reality of his situation. He'd never been one to accept handouts, but this felt different somehow. "And you want me to be the first recipient?" he asked, unable to fully mask the hesitation in his voice. "Actually," Rodriguez interjected gently, "we were hoping you might help us with something more important." Harold looked up, confusion evident in his expression. Grayson leaned forward. "These boys tell me you've lived in this town for 40 years, Mr. Wilson. You must know a lot of other veterans in the area." "Some," Harold acknowledged, "though not as many as I used to. Time takes its toll." "We were thinking," Cooper continued, "that you might help us identify other veterans who could benefit from this program. Be a kind of liaison, if you will." Emma's eyes brightened. "That's a wonderful idea. Mr. Wilson, you're here 3 times a week anyway. You could help spread the word to other vets you know." For the first time since they'd broached the subject, Harold's expression changed from uncertainty to consideration. The idea of helping others like himself, men and women who'd served their country and now found themselves struggling in their later years, appealed to him in a way that simply accepting help for himself did not. "I do know a few fellas from the VFW who've fallen on hard times," he admitted. "Williams lost his wife last year, around the same time as the stroke. And Jenkins, his daughter moved him into that assisted living place, but his pension barely covers it. Never complains, but I know he skips meals sometimes." As Harold spoke, his posture straightened almost imperceptibly, as if the prospect of purpose was physically revitalizing him. The Marines exchanged knowing glances. Their instincts about the old veteran had been right. "So you'll help us?" Washington asked, his young face earnest. Harold took a deep breath and nodded once decisively. "I will, but on one condition." "Name it," Cooper replied without hesitation. "I want to contribute too." Harold's voice was firm now, brooking no argument. "Not much, can't afford much, but something, every month, even if it's just $5. Grayson smiled, understanding completely. "Wouldn't have it any other way, Mr. Wilson." The next hour was spent working out details. Grayson found a small chalkboard in the storage room, which Emma immediately commandeered, her artistic talents transforming it into an elegant sign explaining the Veterans Meal Fund. The Marines each contributed their promised $50, with Grayson matching the $200, creating a substantial initial pool. "We'll need some kind of system," Emma said thoughtfully, wiping chalk dust from her hands, "to keep track of contributions and meals provided." Grayson nodded. "I can set something up on the register. Maybe a special button for donations and another for veteran meals." As they worked, the diner's early dinner crowd began to trickle in. Curious customers glanced at the unusual gathering. 4 uniformed Marines, the owner, a waitress, and an elderly man, all huddled around a booth deep in discussion. Mitch, the cook, emerged from the kitchen during a lull, wiping his hands on his apron. "What's all this then?" he asked, nodding toward the group. Grayson quickly explained the initiative. Mitch listened silently, his burly arms crossed over his chest. When Grayson finished, the cook gave a curt nod. "Count me in for 20 a week," he said gruffly. "My old man was Army, 101st Airborne. Never talked about it much, but I know it marked him." Without waiting for a response, he turned and headed back to his grill. The matter settled as far as he was concerned. By the time Emma hung the finished sign near the register, the dinner rush was in full swing. The regular customers, many of whom knew Harold by sight if not by name, couldn't help but notice the activity. Word spread quickly from table to table, and soon people were approaching the counter not just to pay their bills, but to contribute to the new fund. Mrs. Carlson, a retired school teacher who came in every Thursday for the meatloaf special, was the first. "My Theodore was in Korea," she told Emma as she added $10 to her check. He'd have approved of this. Next was Dave from the hardware store, then the Martinez family, and soon a steady stream of community members were adding to the fund. Some contributed $1 or $2, others more, but each gave what they could, many sharing brief stories of their own connections to military service as they did. Harold watched it all unfold from his booth, amazement written across his face. The Marines had remained with him, Rodriguez and Reeves sharing more stories of their own service, creating bridges across the decades that separated their military experiences. "I never would have expected this," Harold said quietly, gesturing toward the growing line of contributors. "Not in a million years." Cooper smiled. "People want to help, sir. Sometimes they just need to be shown how." As the evening progressed, Harold found himself at the center of something he hadn't experienced in years: community. Regular customers stopped by his booth to introduce themselves, some sharing stories of their own family members who had served. The isolation that had become his daily reality since Margaret's passing was temporarily lifted, replaced by a warm sense of connection. Around 7 o'clock, Emma approached the booth with a surprised expression. "Mr. Wilson, there's someone here to see you." Harold looked up to see a man in his 60s using a cane, his VFW cap perched atop his gray hair. "Jenkins, what are you doing here?" Jenkins grinned, easing himself into the space Emma cleared for him. "Got a call from Williams. Said I needed to get my sorry behind down to Mercy's Diner pronto. Something about free meals for old soldiers." His eyes twinkled as he surveyed the Marines. "Seems he wasn't pulling my leg for once." Harold made the introductions, and soon Jenkins was regaling them with stories from his time in the Navy. Emma brought him a menu, and for the first time in months, Jenkins ordered a full meal without checking the prices first. By closing time, the Veterans Meal Fund had collected over $500 beyond the initial contributions from the Marines and Grayson. The sign near the register was drawing attention and questions, and Emma had started keeping a small notebook of veterans' names and stories that customers mentioned. As the last of the dinner crowd filtered out, Grayson approached Harold's booth, where the elderly veteran was finishing a slice of apple pie. On the house, Emma had insisted, separate from the fund. "Mr. Wilson," Grayson said, extending his hand, "I want to thank you for allowing us to do this. It's going to make a real difference." Harold shook his hand firmly. "I should be thanking you. And these boys," he added, nodding toward the Marines, "haven't felt this useful in a long time." Cooper glanced at his watch. "We should be heading back to base soon, but we'll be back next week to check in, if that's all right." "More than all right," Harold said. "I'll have a list of names for you by then, veterans who could use this kind of help." As the Marines prepared to leave, each shook Harold's hand with genuine respect. Reeves was the last, lingering a moment longer than the others. "Sir, I was wondering if you'd be willing to tell me more about my grandfather sometime, about your time together in Vietnam." There's so much I never got to ask him. Harold studied the young Marine's face, seeing in it echoes of his old comrade. I'd like that, son. I'd like that very much. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, and the evening sky was painted with the rich purples and oranges of sunset. Emma walked Harold to the door, her shift finally over. Will you be okay getting home, Mr. Wilson? She asked, concerned about the damp sidewalks and his arthritis. Harold nodded, standing a little straighter than he had when he'd entered the diner hours earlier. I'll be just fine, Emma. Thank you for what you did today. She tilted her head questioningly. What did I do? Harold smiled, a genuine warm smile that took years off his weathered face. You saw someone who needed help, and you didn't look away. Not everyone would have done that. Emma blushed slightly. Anyone would have done the same. But Harold shook his head. No, they wouldn't. And that's what makes the difference. He adjusted his jacket and stepped out into the evening air. See you Tuesday, Emma. Tuesday, she confirmed with a smile, watching as he made his way down the sidewalk with a steadier gait than before. Inside, Grayson was counting the day's contributions, still somewhat in awe of how quickly the community had embraced the initiative. None of them could have predicted how this simple idea would grow in the days and weeks to come, or how many lives it would touch. Starting with one elderly veteran who had entered the diner that day with empty pockets, but would leave it with something far more valuable: purpose. 2 weeks had passed since that rainy afternoon when the Veterans Meal Fund began, and Mercy's Diner had transformed in ways no one could have anticipated. The small chalkboard Emma had decorated now hung prominently near the entrance, proudly displaying the current balance of the fund and the number of meals provided to veterans so far. The numbers on both sides grew daily. It was Tuesday, just after the lunch rush, and Harold sat in what everyone now referred to as the Veterans Booth. It was his original corner spot, but it had evolved into something of a command center. A small American flag stood in a holder on the table, and a laminated sign read, "Veterans Welcome, Ask About the Meal Fund." Beside Harold sat a worn, leather-bound notebook where he meticulously recorded the names of veterans he'd contacted, those who had visited, and notes about their specific circumstances. The bell above the door chimed, and Harold looked up to see George Williamson, a Vietnam-era Navy veteran who'd served on the USS Forrestal. George walked with a pronounced limp. Shrapnel from the infamous fire aboard the aircraft carrier in 1967 had left permanent damage to his right leg. Behind him came Carl Peterson, Army, who'd served during Desert Storm. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Harold called, waving them over. "Right on time." George settled into the booth with a grunt. "Wouldn't miss it, Harold. Carl here wasn't sure about coming, but I told him he'd be a fool to pass up Mitch's meatloaf." Carl, younger than the other two men but with the weathered look of someone who'd seen hard times, shifted uncomfortably. "Still don't feel right about it," he mumbled, eyes downcast. Harold regarded him steadily. "First time's the hardest, was for me too, but this isn't charity, son, remember that." Emma appeared with coffee for all three men, her nursing textbook tucked under one arm. She'd taken to studying during the slower periods of her shifts, and Grayson hadn't objected, especially since her grades had been improving. "The usual for you, Mr. Wilson?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Harold nodded. "And the meatloaf special for my friends here. Tell Mitch to make it a good one. Carl's a first-timer." Emma winked. "Mitch already has it in the oven. Said he heard you were bringing in new recruits today." After she left, Carl leaned forward. "How does this work exactly? Do I need to show my discharge papers or something?" Harold shook his head. "Nothing like that. This is about trust. You served, you're having a rough patch. That's all anyone needs to know." He tapped his notebook. "I keep track of who's using the fund, make sure it's spread around fairly, but there's no paperwork, no questions asked." George took a sip of his coffee. Been coming in twice a week since Harold told me about it. Best thing that's happened for us old-timers in years. He looked around the diner with appreciation. Nice place, too. Reminds me of that joint outside Norfolk where we used to go on leave. The door chimed again, and all three men turned to see Lance Corporal Reeves entering, this time in civilian clothes rather than his uniform. His eyes scanned the diner before landing on Harold's booth, and his face broke into a grin. "Mr. Wilson," he called, making his way over. "Thought I might find you here." Harold's expression brightened immediately. "Mike, didn't expect to see you until Friday." He quickly made introductions to George and Carl. Reeves shook hands with both men, thanking them for their service with genuine respect. "Hope I'm not interrupting," he said, sliding into the booth beside Harold. "Not at all," Harold replied. "George here was just about to tell us about his time on the Forrestal." As George launched into his story, Emma brought over the meatloaf specials and a menu for Reeves. The young Marine ordered a burger and settled in to listen, occasionally asking thoughtful questions that showed he was genuinely interested in the older veteran's experiences. "So what brings you by on a Tuesday?" Harold asked Reeves during a lull in the conversation. Reeves reached into his backpack and pulled out a small photo album. "Found these at my mom's place last weekend. Thought you might want to see them." He opened the album to reveal black and white photographs of soldiers in Vietnam-era fatigues, the jungle backdrop unmistakable despite the faded quality of the images. Harold's breath caught. "Is that my grandfather?" Reeves confirmed, pointing to a tall soldier with his arm slung around a smaller man's shoulders. "And I'm pretty sure that's you." Harold adjusted his glasses, leaning closer to the photograph. The young soldier in the picture couldn't have been more than 20, his face unlined, his eyes clear and focused on the camera. A lifetime ago. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered, tracing the edge of the photo with a trembling finger. "Cu Chi, 68, right after that firefight I told you about." He looked up at Reeves, emotion making his voice rough. "I haven't seen a picture of myself from over there in decades." George and Carl leaned in, examining the photographs with the particular interest of those who had shared similar experiences. For the next hour, the four men pored over the album, the younger veterans listening raptly as Harold recalled stories attached to each image, some humorous, some harrowing, all told with the kind of vivid detail that only comes from experiences seared into memory. Meanwhile, the diner continued its normal afternoon rhythm around them. Regular customers came and went, many adding $1 or $2 to the fund without prompting. Emma moved between tables, her efficient service punctuated by warm conversations with the patrons she'd come to know well. Mr. Grayson emerged from his office around 3 o'clock, clipboard in hand. He nodded approvingly at the veteran's booth before approaching the counter where Mitch was prepping for the dinner service. "How's the supply order looking?" Grayson asked. Mitch glanced up from the vegetables he was chopping. "Need to increase it again. We're up 15% on weekday dinners since the fund started." Grayson raised his eyebrows. "That much?" Mitch nodded, gesturing with his knife toward Harold's booth. "Word spreading. Veterans come in for the free meals, bring family or friends who pay. Plus, we're getting new regular customers who like what we're doing here." He returned to his chopping with renewed vigor. "Good for business, good for the vets. Win-win." Grayson smiled, making a note on his clipboard. The Veterans Meal Fund had started as a simple act of kindness, but it was having ripple effects throughout his small business that he hadn't anticipated. The diner had always done well enough, but in the past 2 weeks, they'd seen a noticeable uptick in both customers and community goodwill. Back at the veterans' booth, the conversation had shifted from war stories to current challenges. Carl, initially reluctant to share, was opening up about his struggle to find steady work since losing his construction job 6 months earlier. VA's backed up on my disability claim, he explained, pushing his empty plate aside. Been waiting almost a year for a decision. Meanwhile, the bills don't stop coming. Harold nodded sympathetically. Seems like some things never change. Bureaucracy was bad in my day, too. Reeves had been listening quietly, but now he spoke up. Have you talked to anyone at the Veterans Service office downtown? My buddy works there. Rodriguez, one of the Marines who was here that first day. He's helped expedite cases before. Carl looked up, a flicker of hope crossing his weathered features. You think he could help with mine? Worth a shot, Reeves said, pulling out his phone. Let me give him a call. As Reeves stepped outside to make the call, Harold watched him through the window, a sense of pride warming his chest. The young Marine had been true to his word, returning to Mercy's Diner several times over the past 2 weeks, not just with his fellow Marines, but sometimes alone, specifically to spend time with Harold and the other veterans. George drained the last of his coffee and reached for his wallet. What do I owe for the coffee? Meals from the fund, but I can cover my drink. Harold shook his head. Put that away. Coffee's included. He checked his watch. Besides, you need to save your money for Thursday. We're meeting at the VA hospital, remember? Visiting the guys in the long-term care ward. George nodded, his expression turning serious. Right. Almost forgot. You still bring in the checkers? And dominoes, Harold confirmed. Johnson in room 412 says he's going to beat me this time. Carl looked between them curiously. You guys do that often? Visit the VA hospital? Harold shrugged, as if it were nothing special. Started last week. Figured there are veterans worse off than us who can't make it to the diner. Thought we'd bring a little company to them instead. Carl seemed to consider this for a moment. Think you could use another volunteer? Thursday afternoons work for me. The smile that spread across Harold's face was answer enough. When Reeves returned a few minutes later, he found the 3 veterans deep in planning for their hospital visit, with Carl now fully integrated into the group. Good news, Reeves announced. Rodriguez says he can meet with you tomorrow morning at the VSO. Thinks he might be able to help with your claim. The look of gratitude on Carl's face was profound. I don't know what to say. Thank you. As the afternoon wore on, more veterans filtered in and out of the diner. Some came for meals, others just for coffee and conversation. Harold greeted each one by name, making introductions, creating connections. The isolation that had defined his life since Margaret's passing was dissolving, replaced by a sense of purpose and community that grew stronger each day. What none of them realized was that their small initiative was about to face its first real test. Just as the Veterans Meal Fund was gaining momentum, a challenge was brewing that would threaten everything they had built and force them all to decide just how far they were willing to go to protect it. The following Monday brought unusually chilly weather for the season, a brisk wind sending autumn leaves skittering across the parking lot of Mercy's Diner. Inside, the morning rush was in full swing, with Emma darting between tables, coffee pot in hand. Harold hadn't arrived yet. Mondays weren't part of his regular schedule, but his absence didn't mean the veteran's booth sat empty. 2 older men in Korean War veteran caps occupied it, savoring plates of eggs and hash browns. Mr. Grayson was at the register, chatting with customers as they paid their bills. Many added contributions to the fund without prompting, a habit that had quickly become part of the diner's culture. The chalkboard near the entrance now showed over $2,000 collected and 78 meals provided in just over 2 weeks, numbers that exceeded everyone's expectations. The bell above the door chimed, and Grayson looked up to greet the newcomer. His welcoming smile faltered slightly as he recognized Bernard Harrington, owner of the Sunshine Cafe 3 blocks down. Harrington was a tall, thin man with thinning hair and perpetually pursed lips, known throughout the small business community as someone who prioritized profit above all else. "Bernard," Grayson said with a nod. "Don't often see you in here. What brings you by?" Harrington's eyes scanned the bustling diner, lingering on the veterans' booth and the chalkboard by the entrance. "Just wanted to see what all the fuss was about," he replied, his tone casual but with an undercurrent of something less friendly. "Heard your business has picked up lately." Grayson gestured to an empty stool at the counter. "Can I get you some coffee?" Harrington sat down, still surveying the room. "Sure, black." As Grayson poured the coffee, Harrington nodded toward the chalkboard. "That's your little charity project, huh? The veterans thing." "It's not charity," Grayson corrected mildly. "It's a community initiative. Customers contribute voluntarily to provide meals for veterans in need." Harrington took a sip of his coffee. "Clever marketing. Very clever." Grayson's brow furrowed. "It's not marketing, Bernard. It's about doing the right thing." Right, Harrington said dismissively, waving his hand. "The right thing that happens to be bringing you a lot more customers." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Look, I'm not here to judge. Just curious how you got around the health department regulations for running a food donation program. Those permits can be a real nightmare." Grayson set down the coffee pot, his expression suddenly guarded. "What permits?" Harrington raised his eyebrows in mock surprise. "You don't know? To run any kind of food donation or charity meal program, you need special permits from the county health department. Health Code Section 114.7, if I remember correctly." He shrugged. "Lots of paperwork, inspections, fees. I looked into it once for a holiday promotion." Grayson felt a cold weight settling in his stomach. In all their excitement about starting the Veterans Meal Fund, none of them had considered that there might be regulatory hurdles. "We're not running a charity kitchen," he said carefully. "Just allowing customers to prepay for meals for veterans." Harrington smiled thinly. "Semantics. You're providing free food to a specific population. That requires proper permitting." He finished his coffee and stood up. "Just thought you should know. Would hate to see you get shut down over a technicality." After Harrington left, Grayson remained at the counter, his mind racing. Emma approached, concern evident on her face. "Everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Grayson pulled her aside, keeping his voice low. "We might have a problem with the fund. Harrington says we need special permits to operate it." Emma's eyes widened. "Is that true?" "I don't know," Grayson admitted, "but I'm going to find out." By early afternoon, Grayson had confirmed his worst fears. A call to the county health department revealed that yes, any program providing free or subsidized meals to specific populations required special permitting, complete with additional health inspections, paperwork, and fees that could run into thousands of dollars. Worse, the application process typically took 6 to 8 weeks, meaning they would need to suspend the fund immediately until the permits were approved. Given how quickly the initiative had grown and how many veterans now relied on it, the thought of shutting it down, even temporarily, was heartbreaking. The bell above the door chimed again, and Harold entered, accompanied by Jenkins and 2 other veterans Grayson didn't recognize. They were laughing about something, their camaraderie evident in the easy way they moved together. The sight only made the knot in Grayson's stomach tighten. Emma intercepted them, leading them to the veteran's booth while casting a worried glance back at Grayson. He knew he needed to tell Harold about the potential problem, but he wanted to gather more information first. Retreating to his office, Grayson made more calls, to other restaurant owners, to a lawyer friend, even to the mayor's office. The answers were all depressingly similar. Yes, they needed permits. No, there weren't exceptions. Yes, operating without them could result in fines or even closure. Around 4 o'clock, when the diner was in its afternoon lull, Grayson finally approached Harold's booth. The elderly veteran was alone now, working on his notebook, a half-empty coffee mug at his elbow. "Harold, got a minute?" Grayson asked, sliding into the booth across from him. Harold looked up, immediately sensing something was wrong from Grayson's expression. "What is it?" Grayson explained the situation as clearly as he could: Harrington's visit, the permit requirements, the potential consequences. Harold listened silently, his weathered face giving away nothing until Grayson had finished. "So we'd have to shut down the fund," Harold said finally, his voice flat. "For 2 months or more." Grayson nodded grimly. "Unless we can find another solution." Harold's hand tightened around his coffee mug. "There are 15 veterans counting on meals here this week alone. Williams can barely afford his medications. Jenkins just got his heat turned off because he couldn't pay the bill." He looked up, his eyes hard with determination. "We can't shut this down, Rick. We just can't." "I don't want to," Grayson assured him. "But I can't risk the entire diner being closed down either. That wouldn't help anyone." Harold was quiet for a moment, thinking. "What if we don't call it a program?" he suggested. "What if it's just me, personally, buying meals for my friends? No official fund, no sign, no chalkboard. Just me paying for other veterans with money people happen to give me." Grayson considered this. "That might work in theory, but it wouldn't be the same. We couldn't advertise it, couldn't grow it. And technically, you'd be acting as our agent, which probably still requires permits." Harold's shoulders slumped slightly, the first sign of defeat Grayson had ever seen from him. The sight made something in Grayson's chest ache. "Let me make a few more calls," Grayson said, standing up. "There's got to be a solution here." As Grayson headed back to his office, the bell above the door chimed once more. Emma glanced up and broke into a wide smile. "Staff Sergeant Cooper," she called out. "What brings you in today?" Cooper stepped inside, followed by Rodriguez, Reeves, and Washington, all 4 Marines who had started the fund just over 2 weeks ago. They were in civilian clothes today, but their military bearing was unmistakable. "Just checking in on our project," Cooper replied with a smile that faded as he caught sight of Grayson's and Harold's expressions. "Is something wrong?" Emma hesitated, looking to Grayson for guidance. He sighed and gestured for the Marines to join them at Harold's booth. "We've hit a snag," Grayson explained, and once again outlined the permit issue. The Marines exchanged glances as they absorbed the news. It was Rodriguez who spoke first, his expression thoughtful. "So the problem is that we're operating a food donation program without proper permitting, right?" Grayson nodded. "Essentially, yes." Rodriguez turned to Cooper. "Remember that Veterans Outreach Center my uncle runs? They partner with restaurants rather than running their own food program. The restaurants donate a percentage of sales to the center, and the center provides meal vouchers to veterans." Cooper's eyes lit up with understanding. "And since the center already has the proper nonprofit status and permits, they can legally distribute the meal vouchers," Rodriguez finished. "The restaurant isn't running a donation program, they're just honoring vouchers from a licensed nonprofit." Grayson leaned forward, hope stirring for the first time since Harrington's visit. "Would your uncle's center be willing to extend their program here? We're pretty far from their usual area." Rodriguez pulled out his phone. "Let me call him right now and find out." While Rodriguez stepped outside to make the call, the others brainstormed alternative solutions in case the partnership didn't work out. Harold, whose initial disappointment had given way to determined problem-solving, suggested approaching the local VFW about sponsoring the program. "They already have the right tax status," he pointed out, "and they're always looking for community initiatives to support." Washington nodded enthusiastically. "And if neither of those options works, what about a straight-up veterans discount instead of free meals? That wouldn't require special permits, would it?" "It wouldn't be the same," Harold said, shaking his head. "The whole point is that veterans in need can eat without shame or financial strain. A discount still requires them to pay something. Before they could discuss further, Rodriguez returned, his face split in a wide grin. Uncle Tony says yes. Not only that, but he thinks our program could be a model for other diners in other communities. He wants to help us expand it. The relief around the table was palpable. Grayson felt as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "So we don't have to shut down the fund?" Harold asked, seeking confirmation. "Not at all," Rodriguez assured him. "We just need to restructure it slightly. The center will provide official meal vouchers and will track contributions through them. Same result, just with the proper legal framework." Emma, who had been listening from nearby, let out a small cheer and hurried to update Mitch in the kitchen. The cook's booming, "That's what I'm talking about," could be heard clearly through the service window. As the details were hammered out, Harold watched the young Marines with undisguised admiration. Once again, they had stepped up when needed, finding a solution where he had seen only obstacles. It reminded him of his own time in service, how the impossible became possible when good people worked together toward a common goal. What none of them realized yet was that their quick thinking had not only saved the Veterans Meal Fund, but was about to transform it into something far bigger than they had ever imagined. Bernard Harrington's attempt to undermine them would prove to be the catalyst for a movement that would soon extend far beyond the walls of Mercy's Diner. 3 days later, Antonio "Tony" Rodriguez arrived at Mercy's Diner shortly before the breakfast rush. A stocky man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and the same warm eyes as his nephew. Tony carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to getting things done. He was dressed in a crisp button-down shirt with the logo of the Veterans Outreach Center embroidered on the pocket. Grayson welcomed him with a firm handshake, ushering him into the office where Harold, Emma, and the 4 Marines were already waiting. The small space was cramped with so many people, but no one seemed to mind. "First, let me say how impressed I am with what you've all created here," Tony began, setting his briefcase on Grayson's desk. "In 15 years of veterans advocacy work, I've never seen a grassroots initiative take off so quickly." He opened the briefcase and pulled out several folders. "I've brought the paperwork to formalize our partnership. Essentially, the Veterans Outreach Center will act as the fiscal sponsor for your meal fund. Contributions will technically go to our 501c3, but we'll earmark them specifically for Mercy's Diner veterans' meals." Grayson reviewed the documents carefully. "And this keeps us compliant with all regulations?" Tony nodded. "Absolutely. Our center already has all the necessary permits for food assistance programs. We'll provide official meal vouchers that veterans can use here, and you'll invoice us monthly for reimbursement." As they worked through the details, Harold asked the question that had been on his mind since Rodriguez's call. "You mentioned expanding this to other diners. How would that work?" Tony's face lit up. "That's where I see the real potential here. What you've created isn't just a local meal program. It's a model that could work in communities across the country." He turned to the Marines. "When my nephew told me how you 4 started this whole thing, I immediately thought of the other veterans centers in our network. There are 38 of them nationwide." Cooper leaned forward, intrigued. "You think they'd all be interested in replicating this?" "I know they would," Tony confirmed. "In fact, I've already spoken with directors in 5 other cities who want to launch similar programs. The beauty of it is its simplicity. Local restaurants, local veterans, local communities coming together. No massive bureaucracy, no complicated application process." Emma, who had been taking notes, looked up. "So Mercy's Diner would be the first of many." "The flagship," Tony agreed with a smile. "The place where it all started." The meeting continued for another hour as they hammered out the logistics of the transition. By the time they emerged, the diner was bustling with the breakfast crowd, many of whom recognized Harold and the Marines from previous visits. The news of the partnership with the Veterans Outreach Center spread quickly among the regulars. By lunchtime, the chalkboard had been updated to reflect the new arrangement, and Emma had created informational cards explaining how the voucher system would work. Harold took it upon himself to visit each veteran who had been using the fund, personally explaining the changes and assuring them that the program wasn't going away. It was getting stronger. Many expressed relief, having heard rumors that the fund might be shut down due to Harrington's interference. "That man always was a penny pincher," Williams grumbled when Harold visited him that afternoon. The former Army medic sat in his small apartment, surrounded by pill bottles and medical paperwork. "Never did understand the concept of community." "Well, he did us a favor in the end," Harold replied, handing Williams his first official meal voucher from the Veterans Outreach Center. "Got us connected with people who can help the program grow." Williams examined the voucher, running his thumb over the embossed seal of the center. "Looks official." "It is official," Harold said with pride. "We're doing things by the book now. No one can shut us down." That evening, the veterans' booth at Mercy's Diner was filled to capacity. Harold had brought in Jenkins, Williams, and 2 Vietnam veterans he'd recently connected with through the VA hospital visits. The Marines occupied the adjacent booth, and Tony Rodriguez had stayed for dinner, moving between the tables and getting to know the local veterans. Emma, despite being run off her feet with the busy dinner service, couldn't help smiling every time she passed the corner of the diner that had become the heart of their community initiative. Watching Harold introduce the veterans to one another, seeing the animation in his face as he explained the expanded program, she felt a warmth that went beyond professional satisfaction. When she finally took her break around 8 o'clock, she slid into the seat next to Reeves, who had moved to the counter to give the older veterans more room. "How's nursing school going?" he asked as she gratefully accepted the cup of coffee Mitch slid across the counter to her. "Midterms next week," she replied with a small grimace. "I've been studying during every break." "You'll ace them," Reeves said confidently. "Harold tells me you're the smartest person in this whole diner." Emma laughed, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "Harold gives me too much credit." She glanced over at the elderly veteran, who was deep in conversation with Tony. "He's different these days, have you noticed? Like he's found his purpose again." Reeves nodded, following her gaze. "My mom says that's what my grandfather was missing in his final years, not money or health care, but purpose. A reason to get up in the morning." "Harold has that now," Emma said softly. "Thanks to you guys." "Thanks to you," Reeves corrected. "None of this would have happened if you hadn't covered his meal that day." The bell above the door chimed, and they both looked up to see Bernard Harrington entering the diner for the second time that week. This time, however, his expression was less smug and more uncertain as he took in the bustling scene, particularly the 2 packed booths in the corner where veterans and Marines mingled. Grayson intercepted him near the register. "Twice in 1 week, Bernard. To what do we owe the pleasure?" Harrington cleared his throat. "I heard you worked out the permit issue." "We did," Grayson confirmed, gesturing toward Tony. "Partnered with the Veterans Outreach Center. Everything's above board now." Harrington nodded, his eyes still scanning the busy diner. "Business looks good." "Better than ever," Grayson agreed, making no effort to hide his satisfaction. "Turns out doing the right thing is also good for business. Who knew?" Harrington's lips thinned slightly at the implied criticism. "Actually, that's why I'm here. I've been thinking about what you're doing and, well, I'm wondering if the program could be expanded to include the Sunshine Cafe." Grayson blinked in surprise. "You want to participate in the Veterans Meal Program after trying to shut us down?" "I wasn't trying to shut you down," Harrington protested, though his eyes didn't quite meet Grayson's. "I was just concerned about the regulations." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "And yes, I'd like to participate. My father was in the service, Army. Never talked about it much, but this seems like something he would have approved of." Grayson studied him for a moment, then nodded toward Tony. "You'll want to talk to him. Tony Rodriguez. He runs the Veterans Outreach Center that's sponsoring the program now." As Harrington made his way over to introduce himself to Tony, Emma and Reeves exchanged glances of amazement. "Did I just hear what I think I heard?" Emma asked. "Harrington wants in?" Reeves chuckled. "Nothing succeeds like success. He's probably tired of watching all his customers eat here instead." By closing time, the transformation of the Veterans Meal Fund was complete. Tony had signed up not only Harrington's Sunshine Cafe, but 2 other local restaurants that had heard about the program and reached out. The vouchers would now be accepted at 4 locations throughout the town, with the Veterans Outreach Center coordinating the funds and reimbursements. As Harold prepared to leave, he found himself surrounded by people wanting to shake his hand or clap him on the shoulder. The simple act of coming to the diner for a meal he couldn't afford had somehow snowballed into something that was changing lives throughout the community, including his own. "Big day tomorrow," Cooper reminded him as they walked to the parking lot together. "The newspaper interview at 10, then the meeting with the mayor at 2. Harold nodded, still somewhat overwhelmed by how quickly things were moving. "Never thought I'd be doing press interviews at my age." "You're the face of this now, sir," Cooper said respectfully. "People respond to your story, to your service. It matters that they hear it from you." Harold was quiet for a moment, thinking about the path that had led him here. From the isolation of widowhood to the embarrassment of not being able to pay for a meal, to now, a man with purpose, with community, with a legacy beyond his military service. "You know what tomorrow is, don't you?" he said finally, his voice growing softer. Cooper nodded. "Your anniversary, 52 years. Harold smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling. Margaret would have loved all this, the fuss, the community. Seeing all these young people and old veterans coming together, he looked up at the night sky, stars just beginning to emerge. "Somehow, it feels right to be doing this on our day." "She'd be proud of you," Cooper said simply. Harold nodded, words momentarily beyond him. Then, straightening his shoulders with the dignity that had carried him through war, loss, and loneliness, he said, "See you tomorrow, Staff Sergeant." As Cooper watched the elderly veteran drive away, he couldn't help but reflect on how a simple act of kindness, a waitress letting a veteran eat for free, had created ripples that were now touching hundreds of lives. And tomorrow, those ripples would grow even larger. What had started as 4 Marines responding to one act of compassion was becoming a movement, one that honored not just Harold and his generation of veterans, but all those who had served and all those who would serve in the future. And at the center of it all remained Mercy's Diner, the unlikely birthplace of a program that was about to go national. The next morning dawned clear and bright. A perfect autumn day with crisp air and golden sunlight filtering through the trees. Harold rose earlier than usual, taking extra care with his appearance. He polished his shoes to a military shine, pressed his best shirt, and pinned his service medals to the lapel of his jacket, something he rarely did. But today felt different. Today was for Margaret as much as it was for the Veterans Program. He arrived at Mercy's Diner half an hour before the scheduled newspaper interview, needing a moment of quiet and a cup of coffee to settle his nerves. The closed for private event sign hung on the door, but Emma was waiting to let him in. "You look very handsome, Mr. Wilson," she said with a warm smile, noting his medals and freshly trimmed hair. Harold ducked his head slightly, unused to compliments. "Thought I should make an effort, considering." The diner had been transformed overnight. The usual breakfast setup had been replaced with a more formal arrangement. The veterans' booth now featured a small podium beside it, and chairs had been set up in rows facing it. A banner hung above reading, "Veterans Meals Initiative, from Mercy's Diner to the Nation." "Quite a production," Harold remarked, taking it all in. Emma nodded, pouring him his usual black coffee. "Mr. Grayson and Tony were here until midnight getting everything ready. The mayor's office called this morning. They're sending the deputy mayor and the city council as well." Harold's eyes widened slightly. "Didn't realize this was going to be such a big deal." "It is a big deal," came Grayson's voice as he emerged from the kitchen, straightening his tie. "What started in this diner is about to change how communities across the country support their veterans." He extended his hand to Harold. "And it wouldn't have happened without you." Before Harold could respond, the door opened again as Tony Rodriguez arrived, accompanied by a photographer and a woman carrying a notebook, Sarah Chen from the local newspaper. Close behind them came Cooper, Rodriguez, Reeves, and Washington, all in their dress uniforms, the morning light gleaming off their brass insignia. "Showtime," Grayson murmured to Harold with an encouraging nod. The next hour passed in a blur of questions, photographs, and explanations of how the program worked and would expand. Harold, initially nervous, found himself speaking with increasing confidence about the importance of community support for veterans of all eras. The Marines stood at parade rest behind him, a visual reminder of the bridge between generations of service members that the program embodied. "Mr. Wilson," Sarah Chen asked, her pen poised above her notebook, "what would you say to other veterans who might be hesitant to use this program?" Harold considered the question carefully. "I'd tell them what I had to learn myself, that this isn't charity. It's recognition of service and sacrifice. When I was their age, communities took care of their veterans as a matter of course. Somewhere along the way, we lost some of that. This program is about bringing it back, about saying we remember, we honor, and we support each other." Sarah nodded, jotting down his words. "And to the communities that might want to implement this program?" Harold gestured to the Marines standing behind him. "Look to your young service members. They're the ones who saw a need and took action. All it takes is one diner, one restaurant willing to be the first. The rest will follow." By the time the interview concluded, more people had arrived, regular customers, local veterans, even Bernard Harrington and several other restaurant owners interested in joining the initiative. The small diner was packed, the buzz of conversation filling the air with energy and optimism. As Grayson addressed the growing crowd, outlining the expansion plans and introducing Tony as the program coordinator, Harold quietly slipped out the side door. There was somewhere else he needed to be. The cemetery was peaceful, dappled sunlight playing through the trees onto the well-maintained grounds. Harold made his way slowly along the familiar path, a small bouquet of peonies, Margaret's favorite, clasped in his hand. He'd been able to afford them after all, thanks to an unexpected card from the Marines containing a gift certificate to the local florist for a special lady. Margaret's headstone was simple but elegant, just like she had been in life. Harold stood before it, removing his hat as he always did. "Happy anniversary, Maggie," he said softly, placing the flowers against the stone. 52 years. Can you believe it?" He chuckled softly. "A lot has happened since my last visit. Thought you'd want to hear about it." For the next half hour, Harold sat beside his wife's grave, recounting everything that had transpired since that rainy day at Mercy's Diner, Emma's kindness, the Marines' intervention, the Veterans Meal Fund, and its remarkable expansion. He spoke as if Margaret could hear every word, his voice alternating between pride, amusement, and occasional emotion when he described how the program had pulled him out of isolation. "You always said I needed a purpose," he reflected, running his fingers over the engraved letters of her name. "Kept telling me I was too young to just sit around after retirement. Seems you were right, as usual. A gentle breeze rustled the flowers, sending a few petals dancing across the grave. Harold smiled, choosing to see it as Margaret's way of responding. "I miss you every day," he said finally, his voice lower. "But I'm doing okay. Better than okay, actually. I'm doing something that matters again." He stood up slowly, knees protesting slightly. "I'll be back soon. Love you, Maggie. Always have. Always will." When Harold returned to Mercy's diner 2 hours later, he found it transformed once again. The formal setup had been replaced with the regular arrangement of tables and booths, but the place was still packed, this time with veterans from across the county who had heard about the program and come to learn more. Tony had set up an information table near the entrance, distributing vouchers and explaining the process to newcomers. Emma was bustling between tables, serving coffee and meals with her usual efficiency and warmth. The Marines had changed into civilian clothes but remained, sitting with different groups of veterans listening to their stories and sharing their own. Harold paused in the doorway, taking in the scene. This wasn't just about free meals anymore. It was about connection, community, purpose, the very things he had been missing since Margaret's passing. "There he is," Reeves called out, spotting Harold. "The man of the hour." Heads turned, and a spontaneous round of applause broke out. Harold felt his face flush with embarrassment, but he straightened his shoulders and nodded in acknowledgement as he made his way to the veteran's booth, where Grayson had saved him a seat. "How was your visit?" Grayson asked quietly, understanding in his eyes. "Good," Harold replied simply. She would have approved of all this. The mayor was impressed, Grayson informed him, changing the subject with tactful awareness of Harold's emotions. "They're going to issue a formal proclamation next week recognizing the program and encouraging other businesses to participate." Harold nodded, watching as Emma showed a younger veteran, Iraq or Afghanistan from the look of him, how to fill out the simple form for the meal vouchers. The young man's shoulders were tense, his eyes wary, but Emma's gentle manner seemed to be putting him at ease. "That's what this is really about," Harold said, nodding toward them. "Not just the meals. It's about saying, we see you, we value you, you're not alone." Grayson followed his gaze and nodded in agreement. Emma's got a gift for that, making people feel seen. As if hearing her name, Emma looked up and caught Harold's eye. She smiled and made her way over to their booth, coffee pot in hand. "The usual, Mr. Wilson?" she asked, already pouring. "Yes, please, Emma," he replied, then added, "And thank you." She tilted her head slightly. "For the coffee?" Harold shook his head. "For everything. For that first day. For seeing an old man who couldn't pay his bill and treating him with dignity." His voice grew softer. "You started all this, you know. One simple act of kindness." Emma's eyes glistened slightly. "I just did what anyone would have done." "No," Harold said firmly. "Not anyone. You." Before Emma could respond, the door chimed again, and a television crew entered, a reporter and cameraman from the regional news station. "Looks like word is spreading faster than we thought," Grayson remarked, standing to greet them. As the afternoon progressed, Harold found himself at the center of increasing attention, giving another interview, showing the reporter how the voucher system worked, introducing veterans who had benefited from the program. He handled it all with quiet dignity, deflecting praise and emphasizing the collaborative nature of the initiative. By evening, when the last of the media had departed and the diner had returned to its normal dinner service, Harold was exhausted but fulfilled in a way he hadn't experienced in years. He sat in the veterans' booth, now joined by Jenkins, Williams, and several other regulars, watching as the day's events were discussed and dissected with animation. Staff Sergeant Cooper approached their table, a tablet in his hand. "Sir, you might want to see this. The newspaper already published their article online." Harold took the tablet, adjusting his glasses as he read the headline. From one meal to a movement. How a waitress, 4 Marines, and an elderly veteran created a national model for supporting those who served. Below the headline was a photograph of Harold standing proudly beside Emma and the 4 Marines, the veterans' booth visible in the background. The article began with the story of that rainy day when Emma had let Harold eat for free and how the Marines had responded. As Harold read, surrounded by friends both old and new, he felt Margaret's presence as strongly as if she were sitting beside him. "You see, Maggie," he whispered to himself, "sometimes the smallest things can make the biggest difference." What none of them realized yet was just how big that difference would become, or how quickly. 3 months later, a light dusting of snow covered the parking lot of Mercy's Diner as Harold made his way inside, stomping his feet on the welcome mat to dislodge the slush from his boots. The bell chimed above him, a familiar sound that no longer signaled his entrance into a simple diner, but into what had become the epicenter of a nationwide movement. "Morning, Mr. Wilson," called several voices as he entered. Harold nodded and waved, still not entirely comfortable with his newfound celebrity status, but warming to it gradually. The veterans' booth, now officially designated with a small bronze plaque, awaited him, as it did every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. But these days, he rarely sat alone. A rotating cast of veterans, both local and visiting from other communities, joined him daily to discuss the program, share stories, or simply enjoy the companionship that had become as nourishing as the meals themselves. Emma, now working part-time as she focused more on her nursing studies, hurried over with his coffee. "You're just in time," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. "They're about to air the segment on Good Morning America. Mr. Grayson's got the TV all set up." Harold glanced toward the counter where a television had been installed after the program's expansion began. A small crowd had already gathered, regular customers, a few veterans, and Mitch, who had briefly emerged from the kitchen, his perpetual scowl softened by anticipation. "National television," Harold muttered, shaking his head in amazement. Who would have thought? Just last week, a film crew from the morning show had spent an entire day at Mercy's Diner, interviewing Harold, Emma, the Marines, and Tony Rodriguez about the Veterans Meals Initiative, as it was now officially called. What had started as a simple act of kindness, followed by the Marines' intervention, had, in just 3 months, expanded to over 50 cities across the country. The Veterans Outreach Center, under Tony's leadership, had formalized the program into a replicable model that any community could implement. Local businesses partnered with veterans organizations to provide meals with dignity. No bureaucracy, no complicated application process, just straightforward support from one generation to another. Harold settled into his booth just as Grayson turned up the volume on the television. The familiar jingle of the morning show played, followed by the anchor's introduction of the segment. Coming up next, how a waitress, 4 Marines, and an elderly veteran created a nationwide movement to support those who served our country. Stay with us. A commercial break followed, but no one in the diner moved or spoke, their attention fixed on the screen. Harold used the moment to reflect on how dramatically his life had changed since that rainy afternoon 3 months ago. His calendar, once empty save for doctor's appointments and trips to the grocery store, was now filled with speaking engagements, community meetings, and mentoring sessions with younger veterans. The isolation that had defined his existence after Margaret's passing had been replaced by purposeful connection. Even his health had improved. His doctor had noted a decrease in his blood pressure and remarked that whatever Harold was doing, he should keep it up. Most significantly, Harold had become a bridge between generations of veterans. Young service members sought his advice and experience, while he helped older veterans like himself overcome their reluctance to accept support. The mutual respect that flowed both ways had revitalized his sense of worth in a way nothing else could have. We're back now with a remarkable story of community support for veterans, the television anchor announced, recapturing everyone's attention. It began with one meal at a small diner and has now spread to communities across the nation. The segment opened with footage of Mercy's diner, then cut to Harold sitting in the veteran's booth, his medals visible on his jacket as he spoke directly to the camera. "The beauty of this program is its simplicity," his recorded self said. "People want to help veterans. Veterans need support. This creates a dignified way to connect the two." The report continued, showing Emma explaining how she had covered Harold's meal that first day, then cutting to interviews with the 4 Marines who had witnessed her act of kindness and decided to take action. "We just did what Marines do," Staff Sergeant Cooper explained on screen. "We saw a situation that needed addressing, and we addressed it." The segment featured shots of veterans using meal vouchers at various restaurants across the country, interspersed with statistics about veteran food insecurity and isolation. It concluded with Tony Rodriguez outlining plans to expand the program to every state by the end of the year. As the segment ended and the anchors transitioned to the next story, applause broke out in the diner. Harold felt a mixture of pride and humility wash over him. His face appeared on national television, his words reached millions of homes, yet he still thought of himself as just an old soldier trying to do right by his comrades. "You're famous now, Mr. Wilson," Emma teased gently as she refilled his coffee cup. Harold shook his head. "Not me. The program's famous, and that's what matters." The bell above the door chimed again, and Harold looked up to see Lance Corporal Reeves entering, stamping snow from his boots much as Harold had done moments earlier. Though not in uniform, Reeves's military bearing was unmistakable as he scanned the diner, his face lighting up when he spotted Harold. "Did I miss it?" he asked, sliding into the booth across from the older veteran. "Just finished," Harold confirmed. "Looked good, though. They did the program justice." Reeves nodded, accepting the coffee Emma brought without being asked. Over the past months, he had become a frequent visitor to Mercy's diner, his connection to Harold deepening beyond their initial encounter. What had started as respect for a fellow service member had evolved into something closer to family, the young Marine often referring to Harold as the grandfather he'd lost too soon. "Got something for you," Reeves said, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out an envelope. "From my mom. She was going through more of Granddad's things and found these." Harold opened the envelope carefully to find more photographs from Vietnam, these showing a younger version of himself alongside Reeves's grandfather in various locations, outside a tent, beside a helicopter, sharing cigarettes in what appeared to be a makeshift recreation area. "She thought you should have them," Reeves explained, watching as Harold examined each photo with reverent attention. "Said Granddad would have wanted you to." Harold swallowed hard, emotion threatening to overcome his usual composure. "Thank your mother for me," he said finally, his voice slightly rough. They mean a lot." As Harold carefully returned the photos to the envelope, the diner's phone rang. Grayson answered it, his eyebrows rising in surprise as he listened to the caller. "Yes, he's here," Grayson said, glancing toward Harold's booth. "May I ask who's calling?" His eyes widened further. "I see. Just a moment, please." Covering the receiver with his hand, Grayson approached Harold's booth. "It's the White House," he said in a hushed tone that nevertheless carried to nearby tables, causing heads to turn. "The President's office. They want to speak with you." A stunned silence fell over the diner. Harold stared at Grayson in disbelief. "The President of the United States?" Grayson nodded, extending the phone. "His secretary. Something about a ceremony honoring the Veterans Meals Initiative." With slightly trembling hands, Harold took the phone. "This is Harold Wilson," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. But by the time Harold handed the phone back to Grayson, the news had already spread throughout the diner. The president wanted to recognize the Veterans Meals Initiative with a ceremony at the White House, honoring Harold, Emma, the 4 Marines, and Tony Rodriguez as the founders of a program that was restoring the covenant between our nation and those who served it. When? Emma asked, her eyes wide with excitement. Next month, Harold replied, still processing the information. They're sending official invitations, arranging transportation, everything. Reeves reached across the table and gripped Harold's shoulder. See? I told you this was bigger than you thought. The President of the United States, Mr. Wilson. For once, Harold had no response. The idea that his path had led from being unable to pay for a meal to being honored at the White House was simply too overwhelming to process. He stared down at his coffee, his mind racing back to that rainy day that had changed everything. Margaret would never believe this, he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. But Reeves heard him and shook his head. I think she'd believe it completely. From what you've told me about her, she always knew what you were capable of. The diner buzzed with excitement as the news spread, customers offering congratulations and asking questions about the upcoming ceremony. Harold answered as best he could, but part of him remained detached from the commotion, contemplating the remarkable journey of the past 3 months. What had begun as Emma's simple act of kindness, amplified by the Marines' intervention, had cascaded into something that was changing thousands of lives across the country. Veterans who had been isolated were finding community. Those who had been struggling were receiving support with dignity, and civilians were discovering meaningful ways to honor those who had served. As Harold looked around the diner, at Emma's beaming face, at Reeves's proud expression, at the veterans and civilians united in celebration, he felt a sense of completion that had eluded him since returning from Vietnam decades ago. The circle that had begun with his service had somehow been closed, not with medals or parades, but with a meal freely given and the human connections that followed. The White House ceremony would formalize what everyone in this diner already knew. Sometimes the smallest gestures create the most profound changes, and sometimes the most unexpected people, a waitress, 4 Marines, and an elderly veteran, can remind an entire nation of what it means to truly honor those who served. The East Room of the White House gleamed under the chandelier light. Its historic walls witnessed to yet another moment of American recognition. Harold Wilson stood near the podium, his dress uniform from decades ago meticulously restored for the occasion. It fit differently now, looser in some places, tighter in others, but the pride with which he wore it remained unchanged. Beside him, Emma fidgeted slightly with the sleeve of her new dress, still hardly believing she was standing in the White House. Staff Sergeant Cooper and his 3 fellow Marines stood at parade rest nearby, their dress blues immaculate, medals catching the light. Tony Rodriguez completed their small group, representing the organizational backbone that had transformed a local initiative into a national movement. The president entered to "Hail to the Chief," and the assembled crowd, military officials, veterans advocates, community leaders, and press, rose to their feet. Harold straightened his posture instinctively, the military bearing ingrained in him half a century ago resurfacing as naturally as breathing. "Please be seated," the president said, approaching the podium. "Today, we recognize extraordinary Americans who remind us that the spirit of service and community that defines our nation is alive and well." As the president spoke about the Veterans Meals Initiative, now operating in over 100 communities across all 50 states, Harold's mind drifted momentarily to Margaret. She should have been here, he thought. She would have loved the grandeur, the recognition, but more importantly, she would have loved seeing what their life's new purpose had become. "It began with a simple act of kindness," the president continued, drawing Harold back to the present. A waitress named Emma Clark noticed an elderly veteran couldn't pay for his meal, and she covered it herself. What she couldn't have known was that 4 Marines were watching, and they decided to take action. The president gestured toward Emma and the Marines, acknowledging their presence. Those 5 individuals could have let that moment pass. Instead, they created a program that has now provided over 50,000 meals to veterans in need, while building communities of support that address the isolation many former service members experience. Harold listened as the president detailed the program's impact, not just the meals themselves, but the connections formed, the resources shared, the dignity restored to veterans who had felt forgotten. The statistics were impressive, but Harold knew the true measure of success was in the stories. Jenkins finding employment through a connection made at Mercy's Diner, Williams getting help navigating his VA benefits, young veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan finding mentors in their older counterparts. "Mr. Harold Wilson," the president said, turning toward him, "would you please join me?" Harold approached the podium, conscious of every eye in the room following his measured steps. At 83, he moved more slowly than he once had, but with a purposefulness that commanded respect. The president shook his hand firmly. "Mr. Wilson, your journey from that rainy day at Mercy's Diner to the White House embodies the resilience and continued service of our veterans. It is my honor to present you with the Presidential Citizens Medal for your exceptional service to your fellow veterans and to our nation." As the medal was placed around his neck, Harold felt a wave of emotion he hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just about him. It was about Margaret, about the Marines, about Emma, about every veteran who had ever felt unseen. When it was his turn to speak, Harold approached the microphone with the same quiet dignity that had carried him through war, loss, and renewal. "Mr. President, distinguished guests, fellow veterans," he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "This honor belongs not to me, but to every person who understood that supporting our veterans isn't about charity. It's about community." He spoke briefly but powerfully about how the program had transformed not just the lives of veterans in need, but his own life as well. "After my wife Margaret passed, I thought my purpose had ended. I was wrong. Sometimes our greatest contributions come when we least expect them, and often from the places we've stopped looking." Emma, Cooper, Rodriguez, Reeves, and Washington each received their own medals and moments at the podium. Emma spoke through tears about how her simple decision to cover Harold's meal had changed her perspective on what one person could accomplish. Cooper emphasized the responsibility each generation of service members had to those who came before and those who would follow. Rodriguez outlined their plans to expand the program internationally, working with allied nations to support their veterans in similar ways. After the ceremony, there was a reception where Harold found himself surrounded by people wanting to shake his hand, take photographs, or share their own stories of connection to the military. Through it all, he maintained his humble demeanor, deflecting praise and redirecting attention to the program itself, rather than his role in it. As the reception wound down, Harold found a quiet moment with Emma, who was staring in wonder at the medal around her neck. "Did you ever imagine," he asked, "when you decided to cover my meal that day, that it would lead to this?" Emma shook her head, her eyes bright with emotion. "Never. I just saw someone who needed help and did what felt right." She looked up at him. "But that's how it works, isn't it? The biggest changes often start with the smallest choices." Harold nodded, understanding completely. Margaret used to say something similar. She called it the pebble effect. One small stone creates ripples that reach far beyond its size. They were joined by Reeves, who had brought someone special with him to the ceremony. His mother, Frank Reeves's daughter, who had flown in specifically to meet Harold. "Mr. Wilson," she said, taking his hands in hers, "my father spoke of you often. He always said you were the steadiest man he'd ever known under fire. Her eyes, so like her father's, shimmered with unshed tears. Seeing what you've done with this program, I understand exactly what he meant. The day concluded with a private tour of the White House, followed by a dinner where Harold found himself seated next to the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, discussing ways to better integrate the Veterans Meals Initiative with official VA support programs. By the time they returned to their hotel, Harold was exhausted but fulfilled in a way that went beyond physical fatigue. As he sat on the edge of his bed, carefully removing the medal and placing it in its case, he reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past few months. Tomorrow, they would return home to a celebration at Mercy's Diner. Grayson had closed the restaurant for a private party, inviting all the local veterans who had benefited from the program, along with the community members who had supported it. Life would go on. Harold would still have his coffee at the veterans' booth 3 times a week. Emma would continue her nursing studies. The Marines would return to their duties, but nothing would be quite the same. The ripples from that single act of kindness would continue to spread, touching lives Harold would never meet, creating connections he would never see. And that, he realized, was perhaps the greatest legacy he could leave, greater than his military service, greater even than the program itself. The legacy of showing that even in a world that often seemed divided and indifferent, simple human kindness could still transform lives. 1 week later, Harold sat in his usual spot at Mercy's Diner, watching the afternoon light slant through the windows. The Presidential Citizens Medal was displayed in a small case near the register, alongside photographs of the White House ceremony and news clippings about the program's national impact. Emma approached with a pot of coffee and a warm smile. "The usual, Mr. Wilson." Harold nodded, returning her smile. "Yes, please, Emma." As she poured his coffee, the bell above the door chimed. They both looked up to see an elderly man enter, his worn jacket bearing faded military patches, his posture slightly stooped, his eyes scanning the diner with the wary look of someone unsure of his welcome. Without hesitation, Emma set down the coffee pot. "I'll be right back," she told Harold, already moving toward the newcomer. Harold watched as she greeted the stranger with the same warmth she showed to every customer, saw her gesture toward the chalkboard explaining the Veterans Meals Initiative, noted the moment when the man's expression shifted from uncertainty to cautious hope. And then Emma was leading him toward Harold's booth, making introductions, creating yet another connection in a chain that had no end in sight. As the stranger, Robert, a Vietnam-era Army veteran who had just moved to town, settled into the seat across from him, Harold felt the familiar sense of purpose fill him once more. "Welcome to Mercy's Diner," Harold said, extending his hand. "Let me tell you about a program we have here." The circle was complete, yet ever expanding. 1 meal, freely given, 4 Marines, moved to action, and countless lives, forever changed by what happened when a waitress let an elderly veteran eat for free.